Hello world, how's life? This one is going to be about a rather inflammatory topic. This is Sam Harris and Ezra Klein on race and IQ. So I listened to just portions of the podcast that they did together. It was like the second best podcast ever. It was pretty difficult to listen to. I hate it when people avoid certain points for whatever reason, and without addressing a point, we'll go on to something else, just in a race to obscurantism. It's really frustrating. So I listened to parts of the podcast, but then I decided to just go to the sources, or at least one of the sources, and read Ezra Klein's article that is kind of the subject of their beef. And I also read I think it was David Reich's article in the New York Times that was specifically about this issue. This one, it re-inflamed a lot of things. Of course, the point of this is not to determine what the correct answer is. It's to establish a way of determining what is true, what knowledge we are justified in having versus not justified in having. And this is an area in which it's very important to understand one's limitations when it comes to making broad generalizations about groups, or broad generalizations about what any given particular science means, or what one should do, or in this particular case, what history actually means related to all this. So, just to start off, this is Klein's article. Anybody doesn't know the background, this is from a podcast that Sam Harris did with Charles Murray, and Charles Murray wrote a book that had like a chapter or two chapters, something like that. Just a little portion of the book was about the differences in the average IQs based on racial groups. So different racial groups had different average IQs. Now, just to start off, of course, what one might think right at the beginning is that, well, any two groups of human beings, no matter how you group them, are unlikely to have exactly the same of any given trait, especially something as complex as IQ, but you would be correct. However, when it comes to the data on this and the science on this, it's relatively clear and uncontroversial what the conclusions are. What is not, and those aren't even controverted by Klein and Harris in this vein. What is unclear and where kind of the arguments lie, where all the fireworks are, is in what the cause of that is. So what the cause of the disparities is. And like I said, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we come to an understanding what really is the correct answer, and what's the best way to do that? So this is the position of the author Klein, Ezra Klein. And the thing about Klein is that he gets overly fixated on kind of the virtue signaling aspect of it. He doesn't strike me as having any idea or conception of determining the right answer in this particular case. It's a matter of, and I don't mean this pejoratively, I don't particularly care one way or the other, but it's just a matter of, it seems like he's stuck on making a narrative out of this rather than trying to find an answer to something. So this is what the writer's view is. I just took a chunk out of his piece that kind of encapsulates what his ideas are. The writer's view is, this is Klein, research shows measurable consequences on IQ and a host of other outcomes from the kind of violence and discrimination America inflicted for centuries against African Americans. In a vicious cycle, the consequences of that violence have pushed forward the underlying attitudes that allow discriminatory policies to flourish and justify the racially unequal world we've built. There are just a million things going on in that particular chunk, whatever this person has to say. So the propositions that are being levied here, that research shows measurable consequences on IQ from some historical things that have happened, and these disproportionately impact this group. And proportion, this is an important concept as well, because there's some threshold where you see where you say that the disproportion is significant enough statistically to say that it's meaningful, that there's disproportion, and you'd have to control for any other factors that are possible to be able to demonstrate that this disproportion amongst groups is significant in the way that you're trying to demonstrate that, or trying to argue that it's significant. So I know it gets convoluted, but this is really this is where it gets frustrating. So research shows, and in the article that I read by Klein, there were a couple of them, where it says this little blurb that I just read that seems to encapsulate the writer's view. It wasn't linked to anything. Like I tried to look in the piece for links to the actual research, and there could have been somewhere in there. But like I said, I looked at a couple of articles, and it's not particularly important for what we're doing. But it didn't have a link to where this research shows that this is what happens. Of course, the being able to link these two things, average IQ rates amongst millions of individuals, and incidences of violence and discrimination, that's insane. The amount of information that you would need to be able to do this is mind-boggling to show, okay, what kinds of violence, in what contexts, at what ages, and what impact that's measurable that you control for everything else that could have been an impact on that. And you would have to be able to demonstrate that this kind of violence has happened to any of them, showing the effects of a standard deviation below the average IQ or something like that. And then again with the discrimination to be able to demonstrate that. It's an incredibly complex question, and here it's a throwaway sentence. So perhaps going through the rest of the... Now, I read both of these pieces, but I could have missed, where he had a compendium of the evidence that demonstrates this, so I could be completely wrong here. But it seems like this is such a massive, massive area that it's kind of ridiculous to throwaway sentence establish this proposition in this manner. And then the second part, in a vicious cycle, the consequences of that violence have pushed forward the underlying attitudes that allow discriminatory policies. So the consequences of that violence, so it doesn't talk about the discrimination here specifically as like the catalyst for. It says that the violence have pushed forward the attitudes that allow the discriminatory policies. And discriminatory policies as in, because obviously under the law, we've got Title VII, we've got all sorts of, any given county or state will have their own discrimination policies. And legally, it's equal. So I don't know exactly what it means by discriminatory policies. There aren't. Jurisprudence specifically excludes Caucasian Americans from being able to be discriminated against, and it hasn't been overturned. A lot of jurisdictions, most jurisdictions now would just simply apply the same standard, but actually in some cases there are cases that haven't been explicitly overturned that say that in some jurisdictions that say that a white person has to prove more to be able to demonstrate discrimination, which is a curious situation. But anyway, so discriminatory policies specifically uses this phrase, and I think I'm not sure what this means. Discriminatory policies, and it also changes it from the violence and discrimination are the cause of, the IQ disparities versus the violence caused the discriminatory policies that justifies the racially unequal world that we built. And here it uses unequal world, so the entire world. So does this mean it would have to be uniform across, the entirety of the world? It's literally every country. You'd have to demonstrate that there are, the same part and parcel violence and discrimination, or violence that leads to discriminatory policies, whichever one he actually believes, and show that there are discriminatory policies. And all those would have to be together in any country in the world where it shows, IQ disparities. And obviously you'd be able to compare different countries and be able to demonstrate the countries where they don't have a history of that violence, or don't have a history of that discrimination, or don't have a history of the violence leading to discriminatory policies, don't have a history of discriminatory policies. You'd be able to show that those ones don't have the same IQ disparities. So this is incredibly complex, and I don't know. So later, it's to put it simply, you cannot discuss this topic without discussing its toxic past and the way that it shapes our present. So just, all right, so something about the toxic past. And I go through the rest of the article here, maybe it gets resurrected and there's all sorts of argument and evidence that's demonstrable of all this, but I read the article and it seems incredibly vague, and it uses just these massive ideas and uses those to try to demonstrate some proposition that it doesn't come close to even fractionally approaching. It's shocking. So one of the criticisms that Klein has of Sam Harris and Charles Murray is that they're two white men saying that blacks are less intelligent than whites. I don't, and of course anybody with a functional neocortex can make this point, is that it shouldn't matter what the identity of X person trying to establish a proposition or proffering a proposition. It shouldn't matter what their identity is when it comes to the validity of the proposition. That should have no bearing whatsoever. So if that's what this is saying, that the experience of a black person is only demonstrable in some subjective sense and doesn't have any objective validity, that seems to me shockingly, I don't know, it's patronizing, it's strange to say that the truth of propositions is dependent upon somebody's identity, and it's just a weird criticism. It seems like that space of signaling, the virtue signaling. I know Sam Harris doesn't actually like this term at all, virtue signaling, but I think it's incredibly apt. It's one of those things that is that kind of peacocking that it just wants to. Putting all that stuff out there. Look at me, I'm not one of the bad ones. Of course, just like, I don't know. I remember going through the new atheism movement was really kicking off, and you'd run into stories about pastors that turned out to be gay, and they were preaching against homosexuality for decades in anticipation of being found with a male hooker or something like that. It's got that kind of a vibe to it that the more that you have to say that you're not, it's just like that Thatcher quote, being in power is like being a lady. If you have to say you are, you aren't. So the more you have to say that, the more you have to show and peacock that you're such a virtuous person, the less likely you actually are, and the more likely you're trying to cover something up. Of course, that's I mean, I don't have much of a basis. All I have is a basis of kind of a vague understanding of human psychology and a vague understanding of that phenomenon in human psychology to be able to make that determination. So we can certainly give that a very low probability of accuracy and confidence. Okay, well, particularly in this case, anyway. So then later he talks about, or he's saying that the genetic difference is a historical idea. He talks about Hume and Voltaire being racist. And, I don't think this is particularly relevant to anything that's being discussed, which was the thing that annoyed me about the discussion that he had with Sam Harris. Apparently they did a joint podcast. So I was wondering why Harris didn't rein him in some manner. And it was likely because they did a joint podcast. So Harris would try to nail down one point and Klein would just go, blah, just go off on just talked about history and how Charles Murray you're not justified in accepting any propositions that he makes because of his past and things that he has written or said that are unrelated to this particular issue, and it just got infuriating. So he criticizes them for not having talked about slavery or segregation. I think I have a quote here. Is this a quote? I don't know. He says something about the particular American experience and how that has affected people. And he quotes I think this is quote someone named Block here. Environmental differences then, including the sort that affect Black Americans, are known to have large effects on IQ, Block continues. Moreover, we currently have no way to quantify these effects, so we should draw no conclusion about the probability of any Black genetic IQ advantage or disadvantage. End quote. So that could be a completely reasonable proposition. From what I have heard is that environmental factors could play a part in 20% to 50% of IQ, of what you end up with your IQ ends up to be. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, obviously you need a relatively decent nutrition. You need some kind of a somewhat stable environment, household to be able to do that. You need access to education to be able to flourish to the amount that you could when it comes to IQ. And if you've got, just like with anything, your IQ is going to be in a bell curve. So if you have extremes on one end or extremes on the other end, it's going to pull it one way or the other, but it's less likely to stay over there. There's some kind of a mean that it's going to hover around. So particularly in this case, this one just says that it's difficult to quantify the effects of environment, and we'll get into obviously my ability to be able to answer this question and what are the pitfalls that I have to be aware of. We'll get into that when we get down there. I like to end with that because then it makes sure that we have as much humility as possible when it comes to deciding on these propositions. So the question is, and this is the overarching question here, is okay, is it environment or is it innate? Is it genetics? Environment or genetics? If it's environment, we can change it. If it's genetics, we can't without, some kind of gene editing to make people smarter. And I've always found this strange. I've always found this idea strange. Of course, we want to be in the driver's seat. We want to be able to fix anything with, enough effort or ingenuity or whatever else. We want to be able to fix it. So the bias that people are going to have is that it's environmental, that we can change it. If people go to college, if they have a 75 IQ in general, they go to college, then they come out with a 90 IQ. That's the kind of thing that we want. As far as I know, and based on the things that I have read, and I've read, I don't know, maybe 6 books, probably 6 books on IQ, probably more than a handful of peer-reviewed articles related to IQ and the way we measure IQ and what IQ is like in different groups and all that sort of stuff. But so that's the question, is just genetics versus environment. And from what I understand, based on the things that I've read, is that there's a lability in IQ, based on environment for about 10 to 15 points or up to 1 standard deviation is how much it can move with an amazing environment or just an absolutely horrible environment. environment. It's going to move one way or the other, 10 to 15 points. And that's another thing that never comes up, is that, maybe I should save this for the analysis, but one thing that never comes up is that obviously it can move either direction. And if there's a mean for a population, then the environmental factors, if you have uniform environmental factors, it'll stay in one area. So, but for the environmental factors, if you give the same environmental factors to both groups, then it's going to move the same direction in both groups. So it just seems really odd. It seems like things that they just don't think about. So there was another article that came out after this, that came out in the New York Times. It was by David Reich. He's a Harvard professor of genetics, and weighing in ever so delicately on this idea. And he does it in just the most diplomatic way you can imagine. And it was beautiful. And Sam Harris tweeted about it directly to Ezra Klein, and of course poked the bear and caused all sorts of new problems. But the article called "How Genetics is Changing Our Understanding of Race" by David Reich is in the New York Times, as I said. So he talks about, genetic traits, and talks about like Northern Europeans tend to be taller than Southern Europeans, and this is likely attributable to genetics. It's a lot easier to see things that are physical and attribute those to genetics rather than intellectual. Those are much more difficult for us to be able to do because it's so much more complex up there. Obviously, from my position, and I think the reasonable position, is that all of it's determined by genetics. There's environmental, whatever lability you have is determined by your genetics, and the environment acts on that genetic lability. Your ability to adapt to any given situation is ultimately the responsibility of your genetics. So, there's some parsing to do when it comes to defining those things. I'm sure biologists and geneticists and all that have some better ways to discuss those ideas, but that's my understanding of it. And I don't like this kind of an artificial demarcation that people just get up in arms about. I think it's unnecessary. Another one is that multiple sclerosis is more common in European Americans than African Americans. End-stage kidney disease is more common in African Americans than European Americans. So this again should come in the analysis, but I really think we shouldn't be separating based on race when it comes to anything. I don't think we should be doing it for IQ, for college admissions, for crime statistics. I don't think we should separate based on that at all. I think it should be geographic, and we leave it at that. Obviously, when you're talking about descriptors, then skin color is one of those things that you go to just in general, but I don't think we should be keeping statistics in these areas. That's not to stifle academic freedom and being able to, study whatever they want to study, but I really don't think it's as probative as much of it. It's not probative much at all because there's such large groups, large populations, and there are so many other factors that are so different when it comes to them. So I really don't think we should be taking these statistics. It's also, prejudicial on the back end. It causes people who think about these things superficially, it'll cause all sorts of issues from both directions. So I really don't think it's a thing that we should be doing. I don't think we should be parsing data in that way. I don't think we should be grouping people in that way. Anyway, that's just me. There was also an education study where they looked at 400,000 people. They controlled for a socioeconomic background and found 74 genetic variations that were overrepresented that were known to be important to neurological development. And those 74 genetic variations were found within people who tended to get higher educations. So it was more common in Europeans with more years of education. So there could be, these 74 genetic variations, a genetic track that sends people to get educated, that makes them more inclined to get educated. Now this, I don't know how much, if we weren't talking about racial disparities or something like that, then it wouldn't be that significant. It wouldn't be that inflammatory. It's just like it makes perfect sense. I know people love to pretend that old fiction that makes us feel good, that free will idea. It's nonsense. We have to come to that acknowledgement at some point. It's just reality. And so Reich talks about the profound differences between male and female genetically, expression of those genetics, male and female notwithstanding whatever's being said in the media at any given time, with fire and brimstone and everything else. Male and female, they are very significant differences in lots of things. See Steven Pinker on this as well. They are very different, and we do have to acknowledge that. So one statement that Reich makes that I think should should be applied, all over the freaking place. Quote, how do we accommodate the biological differences between men and women? I think the answer is obvious. We should both recognize the genetic differences between males and females exist, and we should accord each sex the same freedoms and opportunities regardless of those differences. Bam, that's all you can do. Unless you want a fascist government that goes and tries to make equality of outcome, that's all you can do, is create a situation where you have the same freedoms and opportunities. And that's it. You lay it out there and say, okay, good luck. So going on to the analysis, as I said, and I'm going to cover some ground twice here, but I don't think that we should be demarcating based on race other than for medical purposes, because it's significant in that, people should be treated differently, like medically treated differently, because they could be more susceptible or less susceptible to different kinds of ailments based on their race because of their genetic makeup. And when it comes to environmental factors, this is one of those things where it's like, okay, if you really want to talk about this, let's really talk about this. So when it comes to environmental factors that impact a person's, ability to succeed, or is likely to impact their IQ or success in general, whatever else, there are so many factors. Like when you're talking about social, okay, well, there are disparities socially amongst parental abilities and parental intelligence. Should we be normalizing those across the board, or giving people a leg up based on, their lack of quality parentage? Just side note, I've read many a study that suggests that parents, within a certain range actually have very little impact on their children, that it's mostly genetically determined, but still, this is just for the thought experiment purposes. But also, when it comes to the social peer ability, the kinds of peers that you have around you. If you have more capable peers, it might be more encouraging to you, or you might have more ability to get input that makes you better at something. Should we normalize based on that and make sure that everybody has the same peer inputs from, their peer groups, that they're all the same intelligence? Or by the same token, if you're the one amongst the peers who's the special one, who's the intelligent one, should we have to artificially create that environment for everybody, that everybody is the intelligent one amongst their peers? And I know that's literally numerically impossible, but should we have to do that, where we make sure that everybody's the special one in a given group, so that they can feel like they're the smart one and that they're encouraged to work harder? And maybe that's something that's unequal, that should be normalized amongst populations. And when it comes to economic, it's not just economic, like how much money do you have? It's economic in other ways too, like the kinds of benefits that you get psychologically from being industrious, or things that you benefit from. My parents worked really hard, and that's why I have a healthy life, or I worked really hard and that's why I have a healthy life. Should we normalize that? It's like we have to make sure that people feel just as industrious, as capable and accomplished as everybody else, because that'll encourage them to act certain ways, in better ways, in social situations and in seeking jobs and in doing all sorts of stuff. Should we be normalizing that as well? And beyond that, why, this question isn't different there's no difference between this and the question of individual differences. Why shouldn't we be normalizing on the basis of individuals who had bad experiences in their life? If they have PTSD, they were abused when they were a kid or something like that, and other people have not, why shouldn't we normalize based on that? It's like, you get a leg up, you get a basic income because you suffered this and this other person did not. We need to normalize based on that. Why shouldn't we be grouping people on that basis and trying to fix on that basis because we have a perceived idea that they have a disadvantage based on certain groupings that we choose to do? So the question would be, why should any individual be at a genetic disadvantage? Why should that be the case? Should we start, people who are unattractive and incapable of having quality sexual experiences, they can't attract the opposite sex? Should we structure sexual encounters to accommodate for people who aren't good at at sex because they were born being less attractive or less capable when it comes to seducing the women folk or otherwise, or the other way around, or they happen to be overweight or something like that, and that's not perceived as attractive? Should we be normalizing based on that? Is that we have to structure sexual encounters so that everybody gets encounters with the same level of attractiveness and at the same frequency as everybody else? Why shouldn't we do that? And beyond that, I think the biggest point when it comes to Klein's particular point here, it's that, okay, he wants to argue that there are historical injustices that are the precursor and some kind of a cause for IQ disparities now. That's the argument. So there's a very big question, looming question, that would have to be answered here. What is the long-term violence, discrimination, and abuse levied by Asian Americans against white Americans? When did that happen? And when was it pervasive enough to cause virtually the same disparity between Asian American average IQ and white American average IQ? When did that happen? What happened? And if that didn't happen, because of course it did not, I mean, if anything, it was the other way around, that Asians were subject to discrimination, not to the scale of, other groups, but they were subject to discrimination, and certainly didn't tyrannically dominate over, white Americans for an extended period of time, or exhibit systemic violence or anything else. So why did they get that leg up when it comes to IQ? And you'd have to explain that through terms of historical injustices to be able to do that. That's why this is an incredibly complex area, and it just doesn't make any sense when you're looking at the way this whole thing works. It just doesn't make much sense. So why do Asian Americans and Ashkenazi Jews, why do they have such a higher average IQ than white Americans? Where was the historical violence and discrimination that led to that IQ disparity? Okay, so now that I've said my piece, now that I've gone all over that, I can go into, okay, let's see, what kind of limitations do I have on this? I'm not, I'm not an MD, I'm not a PhD in biology or genetics. I don't know a whole lot about this. I mean, I've read half a dozen books about IQ and genetics, and maybe a couple dozen articles, scientific articles related to it, and some other pop articles related to it. So, and, a couple of podcasts here and there. So I can't speak much about all of these kinds of topics. So that being the case, in the second one, the Socratic anchor. So what kind of weight is it going to have? This is unbelievably complex. We are talking about millions of neurons, millions of years of evolution, and structured based on all sorts of stuff. What IQ is, what it actually means, how it actually is applied in social situations, and when it comes to, hunting for jobs and making decisions and thinking long term and thinking short term and all that sort of stuff. All of that has to be taken into account to really genuinely understand this issue and be able to comment on it competently. Not only that, but it deals with millions of individuals grouped together on the basis of a superficial characteristic that exhibit traits all over the spectrum. You have geniuses all the way down to idiots. It's all over the place, all within the group that you're talking about, and you're trying to group them all in the same thing. It's a superficial characteristic in the way that we generally use it. The non-superficial characteristics are the genetic ones, and to the extent that we can understand what a gene actually is, what it means in context, and what it does when it's being coded for, or when proteins or amino acids are being coded for to create proteins and all that sort of stuff. We can only understand this stuff to a very limited degree, and especially somebody who's not a PhD in the subject. It's going to be heavy. It's going to be an extremely heavy anchor, and I might start giving this some kind of a number value, like this is worth this many points or something like that. But I'm not sure how I will structure that. But this is extremely heavy. So a whole heaping amount of humility with all of the propositions espoused in this piece, I think, is entirely justified. So bias. Obviously, it starts with biography, so anything biographically that would be biasing when it comes to this. Now, it actually evens out for me without going into too much detail. It evens out for me when it comes to biographical bias. And when it comes to genetics versus, environment, that question in particular, I'm relatively, because it could be, I've read a lot of stuff about this, and it seems it's significantly more genetics than it is environment. Although, I'd like to say that environment did a lot for me, because I ended up in certain situations or whatever else, and I'm not too keen on my father in general. So I shouldn't be throwing shade. I don't know the man all that well. But when it comes to bias, biographical bias, any other ideas about biographical bias? Like I said, in my particular case, it evens out relatively cleanly. I could have some kind of a mixed in bias. IQ is pretty important to me in general. And lately I've been maybe not lately, it's actually been for a long time now, I've been a significant realist when it comes to just the reality of what our situation is. It certainly seems, everything that I've encountered certainly seems that we are genetically predisposed to, whatever we're going to do. And we're pretty rigid. Like, we can't break out of that mold very far. We've got a narrow band of of things that we can be or do. And that's based on a whole bunch of stuff. So, all that could be working irrationally in the background and making me think that this is unlikely. So that could be a bias, but I don't think that it's a software that's affecting my ability to be able to look at this objectively, but it could be. And then beyond that, I really like Sam Harris, so I could just be biased in his favor. I've met him in person. We had a lengthy, I think total maybe 6-word conversation, so that was good. And he's one of the guys who's definitely one of the 4 horsemen, or the one horseman out of the 4 that I identified with. I hate using that word, but it's probably accurate in this particular case. There was irrational identification where I just wanted to reflect my identity in Sam Harris, so that could be a source of bias, and that's likely to be some source of bias. And it could be that when I listen to the entire podcast, that Ezra Klein makes all sorts of incredible points, but I couldn't make it because I am certainly biased against somebody who can't follow a single point, get to the end of that point before moving on to the next one. I can't stand that nonsense. If you have a legitimate argument, you should be able to argue any point on any one, get to the end of it, find out where the disagreement is, and if you're still disagreeing, fine. If not, then you come to an agreement. Great. But going to something else entirely, I can't abide that. That is freaking nonsense. And so that might be biasing me because that pissed me off. So that could be part of that. So limitations, I don't have any particular credentials to be able to talk about this stuff competently. If I don't have 10 years in, I don't have a PhD in one of these areas, then I'm not going to say that my limitations are minuscule, no matter how many books I've read on it. So I know a bit, but certainly not enough to discount the limitations section. The anchor is extremely significant, the weight of the anchor, because of the complexity of this issue. And finally, my biases likely stem mostly from being a fan of Sam Harris and not liking the discussion tactics of Ezra Klein. So other than that, I think that's kind of where we are. And you heard my arguments on the propositions, and I'm sure this is something that'll come up again later. Again, the purpose is not really to find the right answer in this particular situation. It's to understand how we can come to have the right degree of confidence for any proposition that we hold. So that was that one. All right. Thank you. See you next time.